Henrietta Szold was born here in Baltimore. She graduated from Western High School and taught French, German, botany, mathematics, and Judaics to children and Bible and Jewish history courses to adults here in town. She was the first editor of the Jewish Publication Society and the founder of Hadassah. She was buried on Har Zeitim, outside Jerusalem's walls in 1945, just down the hill from the beloved hospital she helped to create and within whose walls she took her last breath. In some ways, it feels appropriate to talk about Henrietta Szold on this Shabbat before Yom Yerushalayim, but that's actually not why I want to talk about her today. Henrietta Szold was a legend, but in September of 1916, she was a grieving daughter as she began to say Kaddish for her mother, Sophie. This was no small thing back then. In some circles, it's no small thing today. In fact, a friend, Chaim Peretz, offered to say the mourner's prayer on Henrietta's behalf. Why would he do such a thing? Because Szold had 7 younger sisters and no brothers. According to normative Orthodox interpretation of halakha, Kaddish is something sons say, not daughters. Given that there were no sons available and that Henrietta's father, Rabbi Benjamin Szold of Congregation Oab Shalom, had died a decade prior, some would say Sophie had no one to say Kaddish for her. So Chaim Peretz thought he would be doing the family a favor. Henrietta, though appreciative of the gesture, didn't think so. Here's what she wrote to Mr. Peretz on September 16, 1916. It is impossible for me to find words in which to tell you how deeply I was touched by your offer to act as Kaddish for my dear mother. It is beautiful what you have offered to do. I shall never forget it. You will wonder then that I cannot accept your offer. Perhaps it would be best for me not to try to explain to you in writing, but to wait until I see you to tell you why it is so. I know well and appreciate what you say about the Jewish custom. And Jewish custom is very dear and sacred to me. And yet I cannot ask you to say Kaddish after my mother. The Kaddish means to me that the survivor publicly and markedly manifests his wish and intention to assume the relation to the Jewish community which his parent had. And that so the chain of tradition remains unbroken from generation to generation, each adding its own link. You can do that for the generations of your family. I must do that for the generations of my family. My mother had 8 daughters and no sons, Szold continued later in her missive, and yet never did I hear a word of regret pass the lips of either my mother or my father that one of us was not a son. When my father died, my mother would not permit others to take her daughter's place in saying the Kaddish. And so I am sure I am acting in her spirit when I am moved to decline your offer. But beautiful your offer remains nevertheless, and I repeat, I know full well that it is much more in consonance with the generally accepted Jewish tradition than is my or my family's conception. You understand me, don't you? Now, I don't know if Chaim Peretz understood her, but on this Mother's Day weekend, I think we should try to do so. This weekend, I will tell you, is made all the sweeter since my own mother is here. Phyllis Berg arrived just Thursday, and Elian Shamir and I look forward to celebrating with Bubby and Ima tomorrow. Mothers are worthy of celebration, are they not? Henrietta Szold was a daughter, not to her great disappointment, a mother. But as a daughter of a mother, she challenged accepted practice and pushed the Jewish community to honor not just exceptional women like her, but all women. That spirit of egalitarianism, of inclusion, permeates our parsha, Ukratem Dror Ba'aretz L'chol Yoshvea, proclaim liberty throughout the land for all of its inhabitants. But this idea is so very hard to achieve, is it not? Szold loved tradition. She, a brilliant scholar and literary editor, was devoted to Torah learning and to the inherited sacred texts of our people. She was the first woman permitted to take classes at the Jewish Theological Seminary's rabbinical school, where she thrived and won the admiration of her teachers and colleagues. And yet, she was only permitted to study in the seminary once she assured the chancellor, Solomon Schechter, that she would not pursue ordination. Often throughout history, men have actively kept women in their place. Other times, the sheer inertia of tradition and our incuriosity about alternatives has kept women and men, as Henrietta Szold would say, from adding our own link to that chain of tradition. For instance, on this Mother's Day weekend, let's consider the imahot, the matriarchs that we include during the Amidah. Since 1990, it's been an accepted practice of conservative synagogues to add the imahot to the avot section of the Shemona Esrei, converting the prayer from one which honors our patriarchs to one that venerates our ancestors. As we take a look at this newer custom, I want to ponder three prevailing assumptions. One is the assumption that we must put the patriarchs first and add the matriarchs second. Now, this is a patriarchal convention that is not limited to the Amidah. When I'm called to the Torah, I tend to give my father's name before my mother's. And it's surely not limited to Judaism. How frequently do folks, even today, address letters to a husband before a wife? Who's more often primary on the bank account, the water bill, the title to the car? Now, you might argue the imahot are added second not because our biblical matriarchs are less important to their children, but because they play more of a supporting role in the story. We speak of Abraham as the first Jew. He's the one with whom God has a covenant, and that breed is renewed with Isaac and again with Jacob. Their wives played important roles in the unfolding of the story, the family dynamics involved in ensuring rightful inheritance, but they are still in supporting roles. The Talmud in Masechet Brachot suggests that there are certain characters in Torah who are simply more important than others. For example, it asks why only Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are called avot. Why not Joseph? Why not Reuven or Shimon? After all, there were 12 sons of Jacob. For Jews by birth, none of us knows for sure whether we're descendants of one son or another, but we all derive from Jacob. The problem with this logic, explains the Midrash, is that we never talk about three matriarchs. Think of the Passover song, right? Echad mi yodea, arba mi yodea, right? Arba ani yodea, arba imahot shlosha avot. There are three fathers, there are four mothers, and just like the subsequent generation on the father's side, we don't know whether we are offspring of the line of Leah or that of Rachel. So there must be another reason why the Gemara states so clearly, Tanu Rabbanan, Ein korin avot ele lishlosha, ve'en korin imahot ele la'arba. The patriarchs are always three, and the matriarchs are always four. And that's where we find this concept of chashuv, who is sufficiently important to the unfolding of the Jewish story. Here's what the Gemara posits. Ad ha chashivi, tape la chashivi. Jacob and his father and his grandfather are sufficiently important to be called patriarchs, quote unquote. Just like Rachel and Leah are sufficiently important to be called matriarchs. The posterities of Leah look to Rachel as an ancestor. Rachel's offspring do the same for Leah. So in our Betham davening, the matriarchs are viewed as important, and we chant their names just like the patriarchs by saying Elohei, God of, before each one, so as to honor each one's unique relationship with the divine. Rachel, though she had fewer children, was Jacob's favorite, and the mother of Joseph, who was also Jacob's favorite. So that's probably why she's frequently listed before Leah in rabbinic literature. Even though Leah was the one who started having children first, Leah was the one who was married first. And also why we list her first in the Siddur. So the imahot are chashuvot, they're important, but the avot are more important, so that's why they're listed first. So goes the argument. And this brings me to my second assumption with regard to adding the imahot, the assumption that there are only 4 of them. Because guess what? While Joseph and Benjamin were born to Rachel, and Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun were born to Leah, 2 sons for Rachel and 6 for Leah only equals 8. Oh, and there was Dinah too, remember her? Don't forget Dinah. But 12 sons minus 8 sons equals a delta of 4 sons, which means 4 sons, 4 ancestors of the Jewish people were sired by Jacob and someone other than Leah and Rachel. Who were these women? Gad and Asher were the children of Zilpah. Dan and Naphtali were the children of Bilhah. And if you're wondering whether the rabbis simply erased them from the post-biblical story, they don't. At least one source very much includes them. In a discussion about why Parashat Naso lists 12 oxen, but only 6 draft carts in the initiation gifts for the tabernacle, the Midrash offers a few possibilities. Sheish keneged sheshet yamei v'reshit. 6 as is equal to the 6 days of creation. Sheish keneged shisha sidrei mishnah. 6 like the 6 orders of the Mishnah. And then it says sheish keneged imahot. 6 just like the 6 matriarchs. And then it lists them. Elu hain, Sarah, Verivka, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah. The Midrash says there are not 4 imahot, but 6. Why then are they not typically included? Because, of course, Zilpah was not of the same status as her mistress Leah, just as Bilhah was not of the same status as her mistress Rachel. And I'm not going to pretend that they were, but you should know even the biblical text is not entirely clear as to their relationship with Jacob, and therefore their importance to us as Jewish ancestors. In Genesis 33, they're called Shtei Hashfachot, the 2 handmaids. In chapter 35, Bilhah is called a Pilegesh, which means concubine. That's also what she's called in Genesis 30, when she's given to Jacob in place of the barren Rachel. But in that section, she's not only called Pilegesh, she's also called Isha, wife, which is how she and Zilpah are named later in chapter 37. What's interesting there is that both Bilhah and Zilpah are named in relation to Jacob, to Yaakov, but not to Rachel or to Leah. Eila Toldot Yaakov, this then is the line of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended the flocks with his brothers as a helper to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And this brings me to my final prevailing assumption, that when we chant the Amidah in many traditional egalitarian contexts, including at Beth Am, we follow Hebrew's inclusive masculine terminology. Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, our God and God of our fathers, when we add the matriarchs, becomes or is translated as God of our ancestors. Now that's a reasonable assumption given that there is no gender-neutral form in Hebrew. If we're describing a minyan of teachers, 9 women and 1 man, they are morim, all of them. A minyan of doctors, 9 women and 1 man, are rofim. A minyan of rabbis, 9 women and 1 man, are rabbanim, not rabbanot, which is, by the way, even worse because rabbanit, the feminine singular, doesn't mean female rabbis. It means rabbis' wives, rebbes. There is a modern Hebrew word for female rabbi, true. That word is rabbah, but few women actually use it because many women feel that to call oneself something other than a rav is to diminish one's standing in the Jewish community. Now that may change over time. There are more women rabbis who are using harabah instead of harav, but it does beg a very real question of equity, which is where I'd like to conclude. Given these assumptions that, one, we name the patriarchs because they are more important, and that we name Rachel before Leah for that reason. Two, that we name only 4 matriarchs and not 6. And 3, that we allow the limits of the Hebrew language to place women's identities within the context of men. Given Henrietta Sold's story of having been forced to give up the possibility of ordination to partake in academic learning at her level of intelligence and scholarship, and of course, given this Mother's Day weekend, how might we honor the memory of Sophie Szold and Henrietta herself, the mother, one could say, of traditional Jewish feminism? So here's what Abby and I would like to do today. In a few moments, we'll begin the Musaf Amidah. When we offer the Avot prayer, let's try to subvert the more typical paradigm and challenge ourselves to see the text through an equity lens. Tachlis will make 3 changes today. First, we'll say the Imahot before the Avot. And we'll say Leah before Rachel. As we do, consider the chashivut, the importance of women's voices and women's leadership in our Jewish story. Second, we'll include Bilhah and Zilpah, along with the other wives of Jacob. You could argue it the other way in terms of the order of those two, but we'll do it in that order because we're following the chronology of having children, so I think it makes sense that way. As we include these 2 women, consider our ancestry and how often we silence, sidestep, or ignore uncomfortable truths about our origins. Consider also the gifts of our mothers and how, in hopefully most circumstances, they shape us in all kinds of positive and essential ways. Third, we'll include the bracketed text in the Siddur. You may have noticed it before, that mentions Imotenu and mentions Imahot instead of just Avotenu and Avot, so as to push ourselves to consider that naming women as women instead of extensions of men is the best way to see them in their fullness. To paraphrase Henrietta Szold, I know full well that this is less in consonance with the generally accepted Jewish traditions in conservative shuls. I'm not suggesting today that we make these changes permanent. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. I want to stay focused on this moment, on this Mother's Day weekend, on this Shabbat. Let's see what happens within our hearts when we try something a little different. So on that note, I'll invite us to rise for Chatzi Kaddish on page 184.